Hi, I'm Peter Rose. I'm part of the Spoke team. We are in at UCSF with collaborators at NASA and Mate Bioservices. Also involved in this project is the Scripps research team with Andrew Su and Benjamin Good, as well as the FRINK team at Renaissance Computing Institute. So what is the NSF-to-OKN program? Proto stands for Prototype OKN, and OKN stands for Open Knowledge Network, and NSF defines it as a publicly accessible, interconnected set of data repositories associated with knowledge graphs that will enable data-driven, artificial intelligence-based solutions. And those knowledge graphs are in four domains: biology and health, environment, justice, and technology and manufacturing. So there are about 30 or so knowledge graphs so far in this program. So those knowledge graphs can be queried through a SPARQL query. And here's an example of a SPARQL query. And SPARQL queries, you're probably not familiar with that. They're verbose and complex, and very few people have experience with SPARQL. So we worked on creating a natural language interface to query those proto-OKN knowledge graphs. But before we go there, let me talk a little bit about AI assistants and tools. Many of you have use tools like ChatGPT or Claude Desktop, etc., where you put in a question or prompt or query. The chat goes to a large language model and gives back an answer. So that was the original ChatGPT. But then people want to get, up-to-date information. So now there are also features that you can search the web through this chat client. And more recently, they added the capability to run tools. So the LLM is able to run specific tools through a protocol called MCP, Model Context Protocol. That's an open standardized protocol, and that basically tells a chat client how to get context from various applications or knowledge graphs. So what we have developed is a server called the mcp-proto-okn server, and it's in between the Claude Desktop or ChatGPT or whatever MCP client you're using and the knowledge graphs. So this MCP server takes a natural language query, translate that into a SPARQL query, runs that SPARQL query, and returns the results back to the MCP client. And this may involve multiple queries, so until it gets all the data it needs, it will iterate and get all the data back into the MCP client, which then uses this information it retrieved from the knowledge graph to finally, give a response to the end user. So how do you set up the mcp-proto-okn in your favorite AI assistants? I show you two examples here, one for Claude Desktop and one for ChatGPT. So in Claude Desktop, there are things called connectors, and you can add a custom connector. And here you see I added the proto-okn connector, and that's the URL of that MCP service. And similarly in ChatGPT, it works pretty similar. You can also add, the proto-okn MCP server. Let me quickly show you what you need to do to set this up. We have instructions for both Claude Desktop and ChatGPT here. Let me just go through the Claude Desktop one. It's a very easy process. One thing I need to mention is to use any of the MCP services, you need a subscription for either Claude Desktop or for ChatGPT. It does not work in the free version. So in Claude Desktop, you would go to Settings, then you click on Connectors, and you add a custom connector. And then you enter this information, the name of that service and the URL here, and you add it. And then there's one more step. You click on this configure button and you say always allow. That basically tells it, okay, you're allowed to use those proto-OKN tools. And now you're ready to run a query. So this is the query interface in Cloud Desktop. In ChatGPT looks very similar. Here you go to connectors and you toggle on proto-OKN so that now the client knows it should use this MCP service. There are a few things to consider here. Now, as I mentioned, it can also search the web, but if you really only want to search the knowledge graph, you should toggle this off. So you see this is not toggled on here. And then you're ready to run an example query. For example, generate a table of all proto-okn knowledge graphs and so on. So that's the general setup. I'm not going to go through how to do that in ChatGPT, but we have the instructions there. It's very similar as I've shown here. Okay, let's go back. Let's do some demos here. So the first demo is, as I said, proto-okn has about 30 knowledge graphs, and you probably don't know what all those knowledge graphs are. And so the first thing we're going to do is we just say, okay, generate a table of all proto-okn knowledge graphs and give it a name and a description. So we're going to go now to Claude. So in here, first of all, I want to make sure, see the web search is turned off and proto-okn is turned on. So we're ready to go. So I'm going to paste the prompt in here and let's see what it does. So it found, 28 knowledge graphs, and now it will create a table with a description of all those knowledge graphs. Some of the knowledge graphs we're going to use today is, for example, Spoke Gene Lab that contains biological experiments from the International Space Station, as well as the SPARQL, which has like disease information in it, for example. And here we go. So that is the list of those 28 knowledge graphs. And it characterizes them, in terms of what are the major topics for each of them. So that was our first prompt. Sometimes you know already which knowledge graph you want to use. For example, I want to use this NASA Spoke Gene Lab knowledge graph, and I say I want a high-level overview of this knowledge graph and its purpose. So I can specify that by saying if you use the add sign, add and the name of that knowledge graph, it will just search for that particular knowledge graph. So this is how you can uh, set the scope of your queries. So let's see what Spoke Gene Lab is about. So here it says, the Spoke Gene Lab knowledge graph is about space flight omics data linked to human biology. And it's creating a schema here about the different entities that are in that knowledge graph. There are missions, like a SpaceX mission. There are studies. There are assays that measured particular properties and so forth. And this is linked to genes and cell types and anatomy and organisms and so on. So here's a little bit about the purpose and so on. So it mentions, the key relationships. So there are various assays in it that measure different type of properties. That's all listed here. So you get a nice overview what's in the knowledge graph. Okay, let's look at more complex ones. So this was just, you know, s- creating a single knowledge graph, and you can give it the name of the knowledge graph you want to search for, so to speed things up. Now let's do one where we search across multiple knowledge graphs, and we're interested in perfluorooctanoic acid. That's one of those forever chemicals, and we want to know about a safety profile about this compound. So let's go there. So here's a prompt that I gave. I like to understand the full safety profile of PFOA. Start by discovering which knowledge graphs in the system have relevant data, and so on. And I'm not going to go through all the details here. So this is the prompt I gave. So first of all, it tries to figure out of those knowledge graphs, which are the relevant ones that might have information about PFOA. So it lists them over here, there are 5 or 6 of them, and what type of information is in there. Then it's trying to find this chemical PFOA. First, it searched that in the SPARQL knowledge graph. and it found it. Here's perfluorooctanoic acid, and this is kind of the URI or a unique identifier for this compound. It looks for other kind of identifiers that are available, like Cas numbers, Inchi keys, smile strings, and so forth. Now it goes to a different knowledge graph, the BioBricks eyes, and sees what kind of information is in there. So that compound is also available there with the same Inchi key and the Cas number here. And then one of my questions was about biological activity. So it's using the BioBricks knowledge graphs to figure out about what is the biological target of this compound. So here's some details, which pathways are affected and so forth. You're probably not familiar with biology necessarily, so I don't go into much detail here. It retrieves various parameters about this compound that's available. And then we want to understand the mechanism, how does the biology work? How does this compound, affect disease? And we get this over here. So, for example, this compound is involved in liver cancer, for example, and here it shows the mechanism of action, how activation of a PPAR alpha gene is related to hepatocellular adenomas and carcinomas, for example. And it does the same thing for many other diseases here. I don't want to go into the detail here. I just want to give you a flavor about it. And then we also asked about, where is this compound found? So, for example, the EPA keeps track of locations where that is found. So, for example, here's various zip codes where there was an exposure of those compounds, maybe some leaks there. Um, some more details, there's some groundwater studies that are available, so you can have follow-up queries to get more information uh, about that. And here's kind of a summary of how it went about doing this research here. And then there's some, summary at the bottom here. Okay, so that was one example. Let's look at another one. This time, since our project is involved with collaboration with NASA, so we're getting biological experiments from the International Space Station. So we're interested in space flight disease risks. Again, this time we're looking at multiple knowledge graphs. So we're doing a cross knowledge graph query, but we also use other MCP servers, not just our own MCP servers, but there are many other MCP servers out there, which I'll show you in this example. So here we're asking specific details about this spaceflight study OSD 244. It was on the SpaceX 13 mission. Here you see the dates, some details. It was done on mice, some experiments done on mice. Here's a summary of the experiments that were done. They were doing experiments on mice on a 30-day schedule and a 60-day schedule, and they compare the same mice on the same condition. For SF stands for space flight and GC for ground control. So they compare what happens to the mice in microgravity compared to what happens to them on the ground. And we ask about differentially expressed genes at the 30-day and 60-day time points. So we get some data about that here. And then we want to see what's in common between the 30 days and 60-day time points. So it does some analysis on that. And then we create some plots here. So, you cannot just get textual answers. You can also create plots. So I ask you to create a plot here. Don't explain the details here, just to show you that you can, plot data as well. Now, I mentioned those are based experiments done on mice, but we are interested in human health. So we map those genes onto what's called the human orthologs. And that's the mapping right here. And once we mapped it now to the human orthologs, we can ask it about disease. We ask what disease is associated with these genes. And now it's using multiple resources for that. It's using the SPARQL knowledge graph. It's using the ProKN knowledge graph, but it's also using external MCP services. One is the Open Targets MCP service provided by the European Bioinformatics Institute. And then there's also a PubMed MCP server that can search the PubMed scientific literature. So here you see the different diseases that are potential space risk, which genes are involved, and also the source where that information came from. Then I go into the details here. It also looked at PubMed. It can do PubMed searches and identify, relevant publications here. And then finally, it gives a summary here, and it lists the resources it used, to do this study here. Okay, and let's look at another one, spaceflight microbiome investigation. Again, we're looking across multiple proto-okn knowledge graphs, as well as using a number of different MCP servers. So this is a microbiome study. So what they did in this case, I mean, first of all, I asked it, get the schema, and that explains a little bit what are the different nodes and relationships in this knowledge graph here. So it sees, you have studies, you have assays, you have missions, genes, etc., etc. And here are the relationship, for example, conducted, it means a mission conducted a study and so forth. You can see what information is available. Some of the properties have like, measured or calculated properties. They're listed here. And then we are interested in this specific study, OSD 267. So this is the first study on the International Space Station where they grew lettuce on the International Space Station. I want to see what's the effect of microgravity on that. And they were interested in particular in terms of what happens to the bacteria and fungi in this lettuce as you grow it in microgravity. And I want to skip through some of the details here. So it identified a number of bacteria here, and this LNFC is a log FC value. That means they are more abundant in space flight than they are there on Earth. That means there's more of this bacteria growing in space than it is on Earth. And then we ask the question, which of those taxa or bacteria in this case are known human pathogens? And actually a couple of them listed here, they are known, human pathogens, and they are more abundant in microgravity than they are on the ground. So that's, obviously a concern. And then we asked more about the antibiotic resistance profile for those human pathogens. And again, it gives us a little summary here and a takeaway. And then we also asked it to identify any peer-reviewed publications, that support this type of findings. And it came up, with a list of publications here, search through PubMed here. And that's it. So those are, I just saw you three, more complex examples how you can, search across multiple knowledge graphs in the ProKN project using natural language queries. Now we have many more examples. So if you go to this link, we will share that in YouTube comments. So there are many other, you can explore all those links. There are many different examples you can explore as well, and then hopefully you can try your own. So if you want to, set this up yourself and try queries on mcp-proto-okn, I want to give you some tips so you get good results. So it's all about writing better prompts. Now, this proto-okn links to about 30 different knowledge graphs, and it needs to figure out which knowledge graphs has the right content. And for that, you need to be really specific in your questions. You need to provide some context. If it's about spaceflight, you probably want to say that so it knows about that. Clearly state your goal. And it's a good idea, especially in the beginning, if you don't know exactly what you're doing yet, start stepwise, break it down into small tasks and I'd ask one question at a time and then, go on like that. You can also constrain the scope. For example, in one of the examples, I said, okay, only use the Spoke Gene Lab knowledge graph, not all the other ones. So that's one way you can, constrain the scope. You can, and then show you one example, you can ask it to show the schema of a knowledge graph. So it explains the structure of that knowledge graph, what type of information is in there, what kind of relationships exist in this knowledge graph. And if you don't know where that information comes from, you can ask it to, show me the evidence, show me your assumptions, and show me your reasoning. And it sometimes happens that, the LLM goes off track. And if that happens, you just tell it, it's like a dialogue. You tell it, okay, this is not what I want. You You tell it what you want and you iterate on it. When you create plots or diagrams, they may not be laid out in the way that you like, but you can always iterate again. Say, okay, I want the y-axis named this way, or so on. You can iterate and basically get a plot or diagram out that looks the way you want it to. So, a very important tip that I learned is you can just ask Claude or ChatGPT to improve your own prompt, and that works actually surprisingly well. So, this is a very important one. So, if you have problems, you don't get the right answers, just ask it, improve my prompt, and usually it comes up with something better than you could do your own. Also, when you do the search and you only want to search the proto-okn knowledge graph, you want to make sure you toggle off the web search. Otherwise, it may also search the web for that same information. And you can also specify the output. Do you want the data in a table? Do you want to save it as a CSV file? Do you want to create a plot and so on? So really, it's a dialogue with your AI assistant, and you just need to tell it what you want. And then, the examples I showed you, you want to basically get a document out at the end that you can save and share and so forth. And to do that, you use the following prompt. You say, create chat transcript, and it will create a document, and that contains, as I shown you, it contains the prompts, it contains responses, and what model version was used, whatever, GPT 5.4 or Sonnet 4.6, etc., etc. And then you can save that document as a markdown file or as a PDF file. So all the examples I showed you, they were created this way, that I run the chat, and at the end I say create chat transcript, and then I save that document. So that's what you have seen in the examples. So I hope I gave you enough information that you can get started, and please give us some feedback. You can provide feedback through our Git repository, which is listed here, or you can email us, and those of you on the Proto-okn Slack channel can also provide feedback that way. So thank you very much.